Okay, I think we can begin. There might be more people trickling in, but that's okay. So hello everyone and welcome to this wonderful book launch. My name is Flora Hastings and I'm a PhD student in SOAS's anthropology department, looking at public Jewish identity in Barcelona. This event is hosted by the Jewish Muslim Research Network, and I'll post a link in the bio to our website. And this event is also sponsored by the University of Manchester's Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies program and the Centre for Jewish Studies. So today, as you know, we're launching the Arab and Jewish question, Geographies of Engagement in Palestine and Beyond. And we're very lucky to have editors Leila, Farsakh and Bashir in conversation with contributor Moshe Behar and discussant Nadia Fadil. So after about 35 to 50 minutes, we'll open up to questions from the attendees. So please type your question in the Q&A and I'll come to them and read them out. So before our speakers introduce the book, I will introduce our speakers. So we have editor Bashir, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Political Science and Communications at the Open University of Israel, and a senior research fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. He is also the co-editor of The Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history. We have editor Leila Farsakh, who is associate professor and chair of the political science department at the University of Massachusetts. She is the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land and Occupation, and of Rethinking Statehood in Palestine, Decolonization and Self-Determination Beyond Partition. We have contributor Moshe Behar, who is Associate Professor and Program Director of the Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies in the University of Manchester. Moshe is also co-editor of the book Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, Writings on Identity, Politics and Culture, 1893 to 1958. And the title of his chapter in this volume is Competing Marxisms, Cessation of Settler Colonialism and the One-State Solution in Israel-Palestine. Finally, we have discussant Nadia Fadil, who works as an associate professor at the Interculturalism, Migration and Minorities Research Center at the University of Leuven. Her work centers on Islam and Europe, both as a lived tradition as well as an object of regulation. Her most recent publication is Secular Bodies, Affects and Emotions, European Configurations. Okay, great. So I think I'll hand it over to the panelists. And please, when you start talking, just say your name so everyone knows who you are. Okay.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction and for having this panel. I am Leila Farsakh, and I'll be starting just to give an overview about the book before I hand it over to Bashir to explain a little bit more about it. So this book was really, well, the aim of it and the rationale behind it was to put together the Arab and Jewish questions in conversation with one another, for they are not separate as many thought. As many of you know, the Jewish question is one that goes back to the 19th century Europe and was concerned with defining the political rights of Jews in European countries, and which Zionism concluded can only be resolved by the creation of a separate Jewish state in Palestine. The Arab question, in turn, and which emerged around the same time, revolves around the issue of what Arab political rights are in a context of imperial making and decolonization, as well as how they can be protected in view of Zionist national colonial project. The book sought to put these two questions together rather than treat them as two distinct or unrelated questions, highlighting thereby the intricate connections between anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the continuity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is the result of a series of workshops that were organized by the Bruno Kreisky Forum in Vienna as part of a larger project on alternative to partition in Palestine. The aim of these workshops was to bring a wide range of scholars to revisit contemporary Arab engagement with the Jewish question, namely how Arabs dealt with the question of Jewish political rights under the light of European anti-Semitism and Zionism, as well as to explore Jewish engagement with the Arab question, namely how Zionism and non-Zionist Jewish voices dealt with Palestinian presence and political rights in historical Palestine. The aim of these scholars in workshop was to explore how these two Arab and Jewish questions are inextricably intertwined and are concerned with the question of citizens' rights, the problem of nationalism, and how to achieve political equality for all. More specifically, our book seeks to expose the connection between the Arab and Jewish question at three main levels. First, historically, and this is what the first part of the book tries to do, namely to show how the Arab and Jewish questions are tied to Europe, to history of anti-Semitism, and specifically to Europe's failure to deal with the non-Christian other within it, both in the past and in the present, as the problem of Islamophobia reveals today. And also to highlight how Europe's reliance on colonialism to transport the Arab and Jewish question elsewhere, thereby aggravating them. Both are tied to Europe's failure to deal with its history and its present, both its colonial legacies and racial privileges and priorities today, and one that makes the link between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia obvious rather than distinct. Secondly, the book discusses how the Arab and Jewish questions are connected politically, and this is what the second part of the book tries to do. Here, the aim was to explore the political connection between the Arab and Jewish questions as they are tied to the question of rights, namely citizenship and equality, and how these can be protected and under what political shape or system. Here, the aim was to highlight the role of nationalism in aggravating the Arab and Jewish question rather than solving them, since nationalism dichotomizes identity rather than celebrates diversity and tends to create hegemonic and exclusionary understanding of citizenship that oppresses people rather than protect them. This is best exemplified with the figure of the Arab Jew, which a few chapters discuss in more detail here in our second part of the book, explaining how the Arab dimension of Jewishness was ostracized, just as the Jewish dimension of Arab identity was negated and oppressed as a result of hegemonic and ethnic definition of the nation state. And thirdly, the book puts the Arab and Jewish questions in conversation with one another in order to start to envisage a solution to this question, one that goes beyond partition as an answer and which transcends ethnic nationalism. The third part of the book focuses precisely on some of the issues that need to be addressed when we start to envisage an alternative to the present impasse, to the present stubborn realities we find on the ground, one which is of continuing Nakba in dispossession, and one that requires of us to go beyond partition as a political paradigm and to rethink nationalism in more inclusive terms, in terms that can protect the rights of others, be it Jews, Kurdish, Yazidi, as equal rather than a minority, and thus foster a political structure of inclusivity and equality and accountability. This book is about opening these important conversations and offer means to expand them rather than conclude them. I will stop here and let Bashir speak further to situate them in the larger political and theoretical dimension. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila, very much. Thanks, everyone, for organizing this. So my intervention is going to be very brief, and I am going to really contextualize and locate this specific book in a larger context of intellectual engagement that has been informing our work, mostly at the Bruno Kreisky Forum, which we are very grateful for hosting this project and many other projects that we are related to. So this book, The Arab and the Jewish Question, is part and parcel of a larger project. And that larger project has, other two dimensions, and all put together, they constitute and form three components, three pillars. The first pillar is alternatives to partition. The second pillar is the memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba. And the third pillar is obviously this book that is at our hands today and is subject to discussion. Now, let me briefly say some few things about each one of them without repeating much of what Leila said in relation to each one of them. And both two of these dimensions were discussed and continue to be discussed heavily at the Kreisky Forum, who has been generous and kind enough to host us in Vienna, hosting dozens of leading Arab and Jewish and international scholars to come together to debate these types of things. So this is an opportunity really to thank them for being so kind and generous to host this. So the first component is alternatives to partition. this is an attempt to really interrogate to which extent the frame of partition is the only game in town and the only frame within which we articulate epistemologically, politically, the question of Israel-Palestine. And this goes beyond Israel-Palestine, obviously, by trying to interrogate the whole entire imperial notion of partition as a frame within which we articulate political claims, given the collapse of the imperial order and the rise of the national order and the way imperial powers dealt with certain contexts, definitely the British in specific. And in the very specific context of Israel-Palestine, in light of the continuous expansionist colonial Israeli project, this becomes even much more pressing to rethink the concept of partition as whether it is the only frame within which we really imagine, articulate, contemplate possible tracks of solutions or way forward in the context of Israel-Palestine. And we really subject these things into a very kind of serious debates and trying to open the floor heavily and widely for new tractions and new venues. And by the way, this project has been ongoing for 14 years now, or almost 13 years, when these things were not popular and were not very fashionable in academic and university venues. And in that sense, the Kreisky Forum has been really very pioneering in being ahead of everyone, or many at least, in hosting these types of conversations. The second one is Memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba, which I'm very grateful to my colleague and a friend, Amos Goldberg, who has been a remarkable partner all the way through in terms of trying to put the Holocaust and the Nakba in conversation, and really discussing these memories together as traumas, and to see what might be the possible constructive, instructive way of putting the Holocaust and the Nakba in conversation, given the fact that actually they are inseparable and interconnected, definitely at least when they come into the context of Israel-Palestine and the history. And the attempt of that project has been, what are the results of trying to put these, memories and traumas together in conversation, given the realizations, obviously, is that there are serious asymmetries in magnitude and in connections and different responsibilities that are involved. But we actually, at least I in this equation, came to this project together with Amos further, and based on the realization that the first project about alternatives to partition, really one of the things that lent support to really go back and frame the question of Israel-Palestine deeply into the Nakba and earlier period of time, and therefore, also extend that beyond Palestine to Europe, and not only Europe as the British, the usual suspects, which is definitely the case, but also to go beyond that and to interrogate anti-Semitism and the Jewish question. And this takes me to the third part of it, which is basically the third dimension or the third pillar of the project, which is basically the Arab and the Jewish question, which here I'm very glad and honored to have the partnership of Leila that has been a remarkable journey with her, but also Nadia, Fadil, and Moshe have been really very involved in this project for the past 10 years. So I am very pleased that they will add from their own perspective and their experience of this project. And this project, obviously, very briefly, i.e. this book at our hands today, is trying basically to make it a very simple claim that there are usually three questions, three struggles, three histories that usually are often depicted as if they are separated, unrelated. And our project is, or in this book, we are trying to make the claim that actually they are connected and interlinked. Now, but I want to conclude with two further points that I think are extremely critical for understanding this project. These three pillars or three projects that were published in three books, one at the Kreisky Forum and two of them at basically Columbia University Press. These three elements, three pillars, in my understanding at least, are informed by two very important tracks that I think are extremely critical to understand the underpinning motivations of these projects. One is basically interrogating modernity. And in the larger context of really framing this, and interrogating modernity, I want to choose really two very constitutive terms, components of this interrogating modernity. And that is basically the nation state as a new player, as the new grammar that really dominates the international scene and politics following the First World War, and its desire and drive for homogeneity and purity. And I think really this is an extremely important historical and intellectual reference and context within which we need to understand this. And this is why we need to locate Israel-Palestine and the Jewish and the Arab question in relation to these questions, and surely the Holocaust and the Nakba. The second dimension or the second component of interrogating modernity is basically settler colonialism or colonialism. And I think it would be a huge failure and misconception to understand many of these dynamics in isolations from settler colonialism as a very powerful mechanism and power and logic that dominated certain scenes, and definitely in the context of Israel-Palestine, and continues to do that in a very ruthless way, which actually part of the crisis that we witness in Israel-Palestine. And the second track, the first track is Interrogating Modernity. The second track is what is extremely important to me, at least, and this is what has been informing my work for the past 8 years, is the ethics of binationalism. And the ethics of binationalism, I think, is an extremely important intervention to understand at least my motivation to be active in these projects. And that is the belief that I think the only way forward for the future of Israel-Palestine is to be informed by the principles and the ethics of parity, reciprocity, and mutual legitimacy that is premised, obviously, in the logic of decolonization and eliminating any form of Jewish exclusivity and supremacy, and coming to terms, obviously, through a process of historical reconciliations with the ongoing consequences of the Nakba. And in that sense, this intervention has very serious communication and dialogue with the three dimensions that I just mentioned. That is the alternatives to partition, the Arab and the Jewish question, and the Holocaust and the Nakba. Because this interventions of binationalism becomes timely, as Moshe Behar indicates in his fascinating article in the book, that it's actually transcends and actually interrogate and challenges, some dimensions of commitment to liberal kind of principle in that sense. And I think these distinctions are often not really made in a very clear, consistent, coherent way. That is that, the liberal democratic state and the binational ethics are usually used interchangeably, and that's very problematic. The last thing that I want to say is the following. Under no circumstances, Leila and I, at least I can speak on behalf of me and Leila as far as I understand our project, under no circumstances our book that is under discussion today, the Arab and the Jewish question, is the only way and the only appropriate frame to rethink the question of Israel-Palestine and many other things beyond Israel-Palestine. But actually, it comes as a very important intervention at a time of impasse and crisis in different fields and disciplines and in realpolitik, through which we see that there is a very deep need and a very urgent pressing necessity to rethink the question of Israel-Palestine along different lines, and by extensions also to reflect critically on what is happening in the Arab world, and definitely the rise of new forms of anti-Semitism in Europe and different parts of the West. So therefore, under no circumstances we are suggesting that this is the only lens or the only angle through which you interrogate these types of questions. But definitely, we think there is some unique dimensions that we bring into the table that are often overlooked and not brought in the prominence that we do in our projects. And in that sense, we definitely think that this is an introductory, reflective, initial remarks for a further conversations to push these types of boundaries and domains further. Whereas our commitment is really to create these venues that in an instructive, constructive fashion to think about how we can move to, to new tracks through which we are can promote, profound egalitarian Arab-Jewish partnership that actually eliminates any form of Jewish exclusivity and supremacy of any sort that is premised in decolonization and historical reconciliation. But back to the book, so I am not really, I don't want to cause disorientation. And if I were to summarize the book tries to do three things. That is, the Arab and the Jewish question book is trying to do three things very briefly. One, interrogating Europe. The second thing is interrogating Zionism. And the third thing is interrogating Arab nationalism. And thank you very much. And I look forward to hear Moshe and Nadia.
All right. Thank you, Bashir and Leila. It's good to see you. And thank you for the 115 people that did bother to come and hear us, which we're not taking for granted. I think that I was invited initially to join the group. It was in 2013 because of work that I did before. And the work addressed mostly the history of Jews indigenous to the Middle East. So Jews, non-European Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Arab Jews, Oriental Jews, they have a lot of names. But then as we went along, my decision was to try and contribute to the discussion about partition, colonialism, Zionism, by highlighting a debate that took place among Marxists in the region, right? And it was around 1967. And I was trying to revisit this debate between the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine on the one hand, and the Matzpen group in Palestine, Israel on the other hand. And I'm also happy I'm revealing that one of the founders of Matzpen is with us here, Moshe. And I'm very happy that he did join, because I have a lot of respect to all the work that he did. And the debate there was about the relationship between nationalism and colonialism. And the reason that there was a need to revisit this post-1967 debate between these schools, because this debate is very relevant to the 21st century discussion about alternative to partition. So that's my contribution in the book. And because I suspect that very few people did read it, and now I want to actually, I choose to do something a little bit different, and maybe join the discussion of Leila and Bashir about this amazing project that emerged in Vienna with the help of the Kreisky Institute, which I can tell you during the last decade, I think that it was very unique, because it is not easy in the second decade of the 20th century, especially after the second Intifada and everything that happened in the 21st century. It was definitely not easy to bring into a single room Israeli, international, and Palestinian scholars. It was really very, very complicated issues of positioning, issues of normalization. It's a very challenging project. And I'm going to reveal the fact that initially during the first 2 years, the two groups were separate. So there was a Jewish question that discussed the Arab question, a Jewish group that discussed the Arab question, and Palestinian Arabs who discussed the Jewish question. And it was only later on, after some confidence was built, right, that people were very apprehensive. It's not easy. That people, especially academics, right, that after 2 years or so, for the first time, the people sat in one room. And in many respects, given everything that is going on in the world, in Palestine, here in the UK, I'm speaking from Manchester, Brexit, GLIM, I mean, all of this neo-fascism that is running amok all over the world, suddenly you would have in Vienna a group of people that come from so many different directions to discuss such complicated issues. And then I'm going to say a few words about the Jewish and the Arab questions. So we all know that Zionism emerged in the late 19th century as one option to address the minority question of Jews in Europe. Zionism is European. And then the Zionists, you know, they somehow debated with their Marxists and Bundists around them, and they ended up in Palestine. And they realized that there's an indigenous Arab community there. And then the phrase Arab question emerged. What does it mean? What are the Zionists going to do in Ottoman Palestine, late Ottoman Palestine, given the fact that the land is not empty? So that's the phrase of the Arab question. Later on, this Arab question became the Palestinian question. And I think later on, if we use Edward Said's book, 1978, the question of Palestine. So when we say ordinarily the Arab question, we mean the question of Palestine. But in a way, what I think we managed to agree upon in this group of, I don't know, 20, 30, Bashir and Leila can say more, is the fact that it is best to see the Arab question in an even broader sense. And here is the issue of partition is important. Because, I mean, if I'm trying to historicize what Bashir and Leila said, and that's what I'm going to do, it's a bit daring. This is something that I did in my work. In many respects, the proposal to partition Palestine into two states that emerged in 1937 around the Peel Commission, right, this moment this moment was the first second that, in a way, Zionism itself helped to generate a new Jewish question in the Arab Middle East. So this was there was no Jewish question in the Arab Middle East, right? The Jewish question that emerged in the late 1930s and early 1940s became part of Arab politics. This was totally new. And here, I mean, the Jewish question now became the Arab question. It's the two sides of the same coin. So from a Jewish question, is it possible to create space whereby Jews can be members of a sovereign Arab entity, even a regional one? It doesn't even have to be specific to a certain state. Can Arab nationalism accommodate, right, in a democratic fashion, the inclusion of Jews in the region? This was, in a way, a broader Arab question, right? What I suggest here is that, in a way, this was the moment, the late 1930s, that we still live in this moment now. This was the moment where the Palestine question became regionalized, in a way. It became a regional question because most studies, if you read the literature about the question of Palestine, Israel, most people usually say that the regional dimension of the Palestine question appeared in 1948 when the British withdrew, right? And suddenly you had some Arab armies moving into Palestine. By the way, they moved into the territory that was allocated to the Arab state in the United Nations Resolution 181. This is something that people forget. Right? But what I think that we managed to agree in this group, and of course Bashir, Leila can correct me, is that actually this process occurred 10 years earlier. And it occurred not because, in a way, it was the Palestine question that migrated to Baghdad and Egypt or Cairo, rather than the other way around. It is the expansion of the Palestine question elsewhere that suddenly made the importance of the regional dimension, rendered it so important for the question of Palestine. And I think that by now it is very clear that I don't think that we have a way out to the question of Palestine without some thinking that goes beyond the river and the sea. And this I'm following up what Bashir said, the question of Palestine and the question of colonialism and the tension between colonialism and Zionism in the 21st century is a question that can no longer be understood within the boundaries between the Jordan River or the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, there is a need to think bigger in a way. And in a way that what Vienna and Bashir and Leila enabled us is to link the question of Palestine to all those other variables, if you want to be a positivist here, all those other issues that that needs to be factored into the discussion, because without them there's no way out. And if Flora, I have 1 more minute, I am going to conclude with one proposition. If I take this debate all the way back to the 21st century and the question of binationalism, because in a way, I mean, what is the debate in relation to the alternative to partition? We know that partition doesn't work because colonization is taking place all the time. We know that the state of Israel doesn't have any intention to surrender territory to the Palestinians at all. So the people there would need to live with each other on the entire territory. And now the debate about that, I mean, what is the way out? That's why the phrase cessation of settler colonialism is part of my chapter in the book. How do you end settler colonialism? How can you terminate this process? And there are 2 options here, right? Either that one proposes a liberal solution that sees mostly a collection of individuals that live between the river and the sea, about 14 million people that are supposed to secure equal rights on an individual basis. Here you can think of South Africa in a way, post-apartheid South Africa, and the question whether this scheme can terminate colonialism and move us out of the situation. And the other school to which I belong, and that's the chapter that I contribute to the book. I took a position here for better or worse. People are going to either dislike me or like me. I mean, but at least I took a position here, and I said, no, I mean, it is equally important to recognize the fact that in 2021, there are also collectivities there. And the issue here is that you need to somehow accommodate individual rights, of course, but also collective rights. That's the result of the fact that a new collectivity came into existence in the last 100 years, for better or worse. That's one. And also because, I mean, I think that in many respects, the Middle East or Palestine, Israel is still a post-Ottoman entity. Even that we have a mandate system in between, even this British colonialism was there. I think that the issue of collective identities, right, needs to be addressed into the scheme to terminate and end settler colonialism. There's no way around it. Addressing individual rights alone is probably not going to deliver the goods. That's the argument that I developed in the chapter by reference to Marxist debates about the national question and collective rights. That's what I did. But I close here. Thank you so much.
Okay, so first I would like to congratulate Bashir and Leila for this wonderful work, and also all the authors. So my name is Nadia Fadil, and I have the pleasure to share some comments after reading the book, which I really, of course, enjoyed doing. So it's really an honor also to be here and to be able to share and exchange on these questions. I've had actually, as you said, Bashir, I mean, I've been, I think, around in the forum for 4 years or 5 years, I think. And I've always felt very much as a privileged witness because, I mean, being based in Europe, Belgium, and being myself of Moroccan North African heritage, raised in Europe, I've, of course, always had very strong political sympathies and affinities with the Palestinian questions, but I've also, of course, felt also very privileged to be able to take part into a conversation and to somehow also try to think about these questions collectively. And so what I want to do is to somehow try to go through a few set of remarks or questions that have come up as I was reading through the different chapters, and maybe we could also engage in a conversation around it. So, I mean, of course, I very much, I mean, I think one of the strengths of this book is really its richness and insightfulness through the multidisciplinary approach that is being adopted. So on one hand, the historical, but also the literary, philosophical perspectives that are being given. And so I really learned a lot. So in that sense, it was really quite amazing, this insightfulness to it. What the book tries to do, and this is of course what you've already said, is to raise this question of binationalism on the Israeli and Palestine question by bringing into conversation Jewish Israeli scholars and Palestinian Arab scholars, and by accounting for the voices of Israeli and Palestinians in analyzing how this question of binationalism has unfolded. And I think you've already explained how quite audacious and unique the whole process has been. And I think this is already one of the main reasons why this contribution is so remarkable. But one of the points I want to reflect at is that this question of entanglement, one of the key terms that you use in the book. So this book seeks to propose a history throughout the entanglement, which I think is interesting because it's a different term than solidarity, which is, I think, a more often used notion. And maybe you could also say about that, how you came to this question of entanglement. And also to reflect on how this Israeli-Palestinian question is entangled with other questions, namely Islamophobia, the Arab uprisings that are also cited in the introduction. Now, I think this notion of entanglement is interesting because it implies both the element of being wrapped with each other and also being condemned to each other to a certain extent. But the way the book tries to take it is also through a productive lens, is by highlighting entanglement through the relationality. Because we are doomed to each other, there is also hope in that process. And I think that's also something that I find really interesting in what the book tries to do, to think about the ways in which different questions are connected to each other. And the only way to move forward is by treating these interconnections to a certain extent. And so this brings me to, you could say, another remark that I would like to share. I mean, there is, of course, the Bruno Kreisky Forum is very much set up, or you could say tailored as an exercise in dialogue, another key term that is central in the book and on which the contribution of Gil Anijar also seeks to reflect upon. But what I see also happening throughout the different contributions in the volume is an exercise in what I would maybe describe as a form of self-critique. That's another term, of course, that one can use, and maybe one can also critique that term. I mean, this is, of course, something that we often are brought to do, this self-critique. But self-critique emerges here as a forced relationship to oneself through the forced reckoning of this condition of entanglement. While it is not the immediate objective of the volume, all the different contributions seem to somehow aim to go beyond certain duality, certain positionality, certain, you could say, perspectives in which one is doomed to or condemned to, whether it is, and also seem to go beyond the duality of Arab and Jew that is then, depending on the perspective that you take, mapped onto a duality of victim and offender. So these are the dualities that one sees the different contributions trying to overcome. But it is not a form of self-critique that is liberal or apolitical, that seeks to restore the individual agency in the liberal sense of the words, but it is rather one that one is forced upon because one has to take these entangled histories and lives seriously. I see it, for instance, in the different historical contributions by Amel Ghazal or Yuval Evry and Hillel Cohen or Moshe Behar, who offer very crossed and intersected account of a very shared moment, a singular moment, the first period of the Zionist immigration and the Balfour Declaration. And what we are often is a very scattered picture that shows these complexities that go beyond the simple duality or opposition of Zionist Jews versus Arab and Muslim. And we see also all these internal conversations taking place, or the unsettledness of these different positions. But it is also key to the contribution of Ella Shohat or Hakim Rostam, who critically attend to the process of the de-Arabization or the de-Palestinization of the Jew that emerges as the constitutive opposite of the Palestinian Arab, or in Mariam Mashrawi's urging of accounting for the dialectical making and unmaking of the Jewish-Arab duality. I think one of the entangled questions that is suggested in the book, but that is maybe developed a bit less, is the way in which is the entanglement of the Muslim question in Europe and the way it is being reposed today also in the light of the Israeli and Palestinian question. It comes up, of course, in the contribution of Brian Klug. I mean, there are some work, of course, of Gil Anijar on that question. And in the contribution, Brian Klug shows how, I mean, through this embracing of Macron and Netanyahu, this symbolic construction of the new Europe that collectively opposes to the Holocaust, and also has the Muslim as the new common enemy. So this is a bit how it comes up. But I think it would be interesting also to think about ways of pushing this question to other sides, for instance, the securitization of the Palestinian and of the European Muslim in that regard, for instance, all the techniques of surveillance and practices of security and surveillances that are present in Palestine and that are also being used as a model, you could say, to emulate in the West. But this entanglement between, you could say, the new Muslim question in Europe and the Israel-Palestinian question, and also to think through these questions of entanglement is for me also important, also as an exercise in self-critique. And here I'm talking again more as someone who is positioned in Europe, who is a scholar of Islam in Europe, but also identifies as a Maghrebi Muslim. And I think one of the things that I found so strong about this book, and this is why I come back to this question of self-critique, is because it is one of the questions that preoccupies me, on how, when one is, you could say, surrounded by a political, you could say, geography of racialization and of Islamophobia, how can one develop a political vocabulary that at the same time does not fall into the trap of the construction of the European Muslim? And what I mean by that is the construction of the European Muslim as a new political subjectivity, as a new identity, as a new subject position, as a unified category that is disentangled from its Amazighness, from its Arabness, from its Maghrebiness, from its Orientalness on the one hand, and on the other hand, that is also disentangled, you could say, from its broader, from its post-colonialness to a certain extent, right? How the construction of the European Muslim also implies a reconstruction also of Europe to a certain extent. And I think that's also one of the key questions that preoccupies me, on how we can continue this exercise of entangling these different questions, also through as a way to deconstruct these categories and to repose these political solidarities. And so maybe I will conclude with one last remark and one last point, and this is also again this question of Muslimness. I think this is also one of the things that struck me in the different contributions, is an omnipresence yet analytical absence of religion, quote unquote. While there is an expansive reflection and deconstruction of the political subjectivities as Arab, as Palestinian, as Jew, as Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, and the de-Arabization of the Jew and the de-Judaification of the Arab, if you want. The categories of Christian and Muslim remain largely unthematized. The polar opposite that seems to be central in the volume is that between a secularized Arab and Palestinian versus a secularized Jew. And here, and their religion emerges when one talks about the Islamization of the Palestinian, for instance, in the contribution of Amal Ghazal on Algerian solidarity, or in Mashrawi's contribution when evoking the story of Samson. And so one of the last questions I would have is, what stories of entanglement could we tell if one was to take this category seriously? Would it be possible would it be possible without rehashing Orientalist and racialized representations that frame the conflict in the region as a conflict between Muslims and Jews, because that's how it happens, right? In those tropes, in Orientalist representations, it is a conflict between Muslims and Jews. But would it be possible to somehow resuscitate some of these categories of Christian and Muslimness without rehashing that story? And how would it then look like? So that's.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for your comments, and thank you everyone for your fascinating introduction and exploration of your book. I wondered if the panelists wanted to respond to some of Nadia's points before I move on to reading out any questions.
Yeah, I would like to start. First of all, I want to thank Nadia for this brilliant and generous review of the book, and also for bringing out certain dimensions. You know, Bashir and I had so far 5 different talks, and every commentator brought up, emphasized certain questions. So I find this, I'm very grateful to that, because you raise in particular this issue of the Muslim question. But I'll start with your issue of entanglement, because I think you nailed it on the head. yeah, we wanted precisely to show the issues of entanglement, because especially when we come and talk about Israel-Palestine, there is, maybe because of Oslo, and maybe because of the depth of the problem, an attempt over and over again to see how far these issues are not entangled, should not be entangled, needs to be disentangled. And we're basically saying this is impossible to disentangle, and we should not. There is more loss in disentangling. There's an impossibility of disentanglement and also a loss that is not valuable. But I also want to we want to remain what also Bashir said and I said, that this book was a first attempt to open a conversation that needs to happen, okay? So we're not answering all the questions. We're not tackling all the entanglements. What we said, what we try to show is what are the key entanglements that we need to look at. And the three key entanglements we need to look at is entanglement of Europe, entanglement of the Jewish and the Muslim, the entanglement of colonialism with Europe, and the problem of anti-Semitism. That's what we try to do. So for some people, we did not cover too much Europe, okay? We should have covered more. For others, we made the Palestinian absent because we focused too much on the Arab and the Jew. For others, you're talking too much about the Jew, but not all the Jews. So to your question is, yeah, you're totally right. There are many categories which we did not problematize further, and I think we could not in a book which has so many different contributors. This is not something we could do, but what we hope we have achieved is to show that you cannot talk about Israel-Palestine from now on, thinking that it's separate from Europe or separate from the region. And you also cannot talk about Israel-Palestine, even if, yeah, the issue of religion was definitely very complicated, and I would give it, I'll say it up front, we did not try to go that place because that would require a whole new book. But we wanted to say this is an important question. Also with the Arab Jew, many people said the Arab Jew doesn't exist. Why are you talking about the Arab Jew? And the point for talking about the Arab Jew was precisely to show that identities are entangled. Nationalism tries to disentangle this identity to the detriment of the people's rights, at the expense of people's rights. And what needs to happen is precisely how to see the intersection both at the political level and the historical level. And what I mean by the political, in the present, how do you address, to come to your point about self-critique, but how to face them face on, rather than try to hide them in either Orientalism or leftist propaganda that doesn't mean anything. So that's really what we try to do. But thank you, yeah, I take your point. Your critique is well placed, but this is for another book and for other people to discuss. Thank you.
Can I say very briefly a few things, Flora? Is that okay? Nadia, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful comments, and a review of this. So I want to choose 2 or 3 points depending on the time and reflect on them very quickly. And that is the issue of the entangled history thing. And I just want to add to what Leila said, that this is why I insisted that this is an intervention of some sort that either contributes to emerging trends or paving the way for new venues of conversation. And in that sense, actually, when it comes to the history, we are not pioneering. We are not pioneers here. There are respected historians probably in the audience who know very well this kind of literature about this kind of perspective of methodology of entangled history, where many things are looked as if they are separate and segregated and not intersect. And there's, for instance, in my work with Amos and with Amos Goldberg on the Holocaust and Nakba, this is precisely what we say. The Holocaust and the Nakba are intersecting. They are inseparable in certain specific historical concrete ways. And it's about time that we methodologically also approach them, not in such a separate ways, but actually these are entangled in a way that, it's really amazing that the Holocaust has been explored in relation to so many things, hundreds of things, but it remained to be almost silent in relation to the Nakba, which is basically in a difference of 3 years, 4 years, or the proximity of this. And obviously the use and the abuse and the instrumentalization of the Holocaust for the purpose of just the legitimacy of the Israeli project and the state of Israel and Zionism, etc., etc. So this entanglement, if you wish, very briefly, builds up on this kind of emerging trend, and I say that Ari Dibnov is here and others who have been contributing to that kind of direction through which, there is this multi-directional memory and entangled histories that are extremely interesting. And in that sense, it's another way of really rereading Europe and rethinking Europe and interrogating these types of histories not secluding them, but actually seeing them that actually, and in that sense is also Africa present and many other places. They were just focusing on this very specific context of the Palestinian question. The second thing that I want to say is about dialogue, and I think this is an extremely important one, Nadia. I'm very grateful for you posing this. When I started this project with Gertrude back in the time, and we had this kind of confusions and entertainment, and we consulted Leila and others, this is precisely was one of the main tensions. Under no circumstances this project was intending from the very beginning actually to call for dialogue. I mean, one of the most important things of seeing all of these three projects is precisely the very serious moment of a crisis, where actually these conversations of dialogue and bringing people to people and bringing Arabs and Jews conversations, while you are pretending as if you are an enterprise of conversations and conflict resolutions and peacemaking, under which there is a concealed assumptions of parity and equality and equalizations between an oppressed and oppressor, a colonized and colonized, is entirely unacceptable from the perspective of this project. This is exactly what this project is trying to do, something different. And this is, I think, why this project is producing somehow some relevant materials that are different from what is existing in the literature. So it's not really about dialogue as much as I will fall into a trap if I were to name what is the alternative to dialogue, but definitely conversation, a critical conversation. And that comes with the self-agency that you were reflecting, Nadia, where it's actually, it is a self-reflection that is aware of the very serious colonial enterprise. And that colonial enterprise is very much embedded with kind of Christian Europe, with all of what it entails, not only in terms of religion, but in terms of theology. And in that sense, our work has been heavily, at least definitely have been heavily inspired by the work of Amnon Raz Kropotkin, who is extremely fundamental for this project, and his work has been, fundamental to inspiring us definitely when it comes to this political theology and definitely by nationalism. So I agree with you, but it's extremely important to understand that this project takes the colonial context as its starting point of analysis. It doesn't conclude that this is the condition, and this is why it's completely different from the rhetoric of Oslo. This is completely different from the rhetoric of let us bring them together. And this is why I think it has been a very, very archaeologically demanding in the emotional and intellectual sense, and it has been transformative for some, at least intellectually and privately. So dialogue in this understanding, and I am very happy about the piece of Jilin Najjar, because Jilin Najjar precisely tries to reflect on this kind, maybe in a little bit complicated manner, but this is exactly the sentiment that, that we are not calling here for, a conversation between, and depicting this parity and symmetry that is really very problematic and neutralizes that kind of colonial context. And the colonial context does not have to be necessarily in the sense of settler colonialism. It could be colonial in the sense of European domination and going to really the modernity type of, kind of imposing terminologies and certain grammar, how you understand regional and international politics. The last thing that I think you are absolutely right is this absence of religion and political theology, mostly religion and some dimensions of political theology. Definitely, this is one of the weaknesses of the book. And there are, and again, I mean, it has been a very serious struggle to bring all of these people together, and let alone that we, we really wanted more people to write. But as you probably know yourself, well, actually, Nadia, you were invited to write for this book, and you didn't have time to do that. Well,
I think I suppressed that memory.
Okay. So, concluding with the suppressed memories, this is precisely what this book tries to do, to bring these suppressed memories, definitely European memories, and bring them to the table and say, these suppressed memories, as if you are now, the Jews have become recasted to be white and they are not Semites anymore. And now the new Semite is basically the Muslims in a different, and this is why your question is really fascinating. And I think one of the tracks that we need to further explore in our work in Vienna, and I invite you here, given the fact that I have been leading this project, I am publicly inviting you to pursue this line of inquiry about this construction of the subjectivity formation of the European Muslim, which seems to be now very much governed by the boundaries of what colonial Europe seems to be depicting as the boundaries of the imaginations and the sociology, and the socializations of this, the socializations of this type. And this is precisely where I see our work as actually some form of interrogations of these boundaries, of these suppressed, limited kind of imaginations that, the constructions of this subjectivity is there. And obviously drawing in the work of Nono and Gilles and many others about this kind of created enmity that seems to be underlying Christian Europe, but in the very specific context here, not for romanticized calling of Arab, Muslim and Jewish dialogue. That's definitely not the case, but it's precisely to unpack these powers of discursive constructions that seems to be at work here, that seems to wanting to have a very concrete constructions of subjectivity in the form of a good Muslim, European Muslim, in a certain way that Europe really wants to continue silencing and suppressing these memories of coloniality that are definitely in a post-colonial condition seems to be way much more effective than they seem to be in the previous decades, at least definitely as we understand them today. I don't have time, I want to give the space to others to speak, but Nadia, this has been very fascinating, and thank you so much for all of these kind of very challenging and inspiring comments.
Thank you very much for your response, Bashir. And I will read out one of the first questions from our Leila. My question is, why do you think the Palestinian people's rights, or the Palestinian question, as you name it, are supposed to be guaranteed through binational state and not through indigenous rights perspective guaranteed in the UNDRIP?
Well, I'll provide a quick answer to this question. The binationalism that we think about and propose is precisely one that respects indigenous rights. But it's also one that does not try to take a paradigm that has often been used in the United States and other settler colonial contexts, and rather think of it how it would apply. What would an indigenous solution mean in the Palestinian context, which is not a South African solution to apartheid, and is not also a settler colonial solution in America or in Australia, where we try to absolve the guilt of the indigenous, the harm done to indigenous people by trying to affirm indigenous rights within still a liberal state. So it's not a negation of indigenous right. Binationalism that we're proposing is actually a respect of indigenous rights, but thinking concretely, what does politically, how do you translate them politically in terms of affirming Palestinian and Israeli rights to equality, both collective and individual rights. And there's one thing, sorry if I can take this opportunity to answer Nadia's, your point about the European Muslim, and I think you nailed it very beautifully, because as somebody who's living in the United States and seeing how the United States has dealt with the American Muslim, the example is very different from Europe, and contrasting and comparing European dealing, the failure of Europe to deal with its non-Christian in comparison to America, how the United States tried to deal with the non-white, despite its segregation, inequality, all you want, but there is a different approach to subjectivity that is much more inclusive and permissive of a more inclusive Muslim identity than Europe permits. It would be interesting to compare and contrast further. Just want to do that.
Thank you for that.
I can say something, if you don't mind, Flora, because I think Ori Davis, I saw that he posted a question in there also related to this settler colonialism and indigeneity. I think, and this really takes me also to the alternatives to partition and the Holocaust and the Nakba project. And this is why I insist that we need to see these three dimensions as part and parcel of a whole. And I think this helps people to understand the larger picture of this. I think it definitely has become fashionable recently to introduce settler, not recently, but it has been out there from the beginning, settler colonialism as frame, but it has become really very fashionable in the past 2 decades and a half, to invoke settler colonialism as an interpretive frame that I think it's more, it has more advantages when it comes to Israel-Palestine than other competing frames, definitely the peacemaking industry that I was just alluding and the dialogue industry that I was alluding. And I think this is absolutely true, and it's very good, and it's a very welcome contribution. So is the discourse of indigeneity, I mean, indigenous rights, treating the Palestinians, but I think it would be a mistake to think about either of them or the combination of them to be an exhaustive, to be exhaustive frames through which we can understand Israel-Palestine. I think one of the contributions of this project, of these projects, is precisely this point, that actually there is a national dimension that has emerged, definitely in the case of the Israeli Jews, that cannot be ignored and cannot be really eliminated by resorting only to these kind of things. So yes, settler colonialism, definitely extremely important to invoke the asymmetry of power and to understand the logic of the majority of the Israeli practices and policies as we witness them. But I think settler colonialism on its own terms is not sufficient and doesn't capture the full picture. It needs to be complemented by other dimensions. This is at least what I understand, my part of this project, that needs to be complemented with that. So it's the case with indigeneity. Indigeneity is not enough for you to understand this project. It needs to be complemented with many other powers that are at work. And this is why binationalism, definitely the way we work on it separately and jointly, at least I can think about Leila and me and my work with Amos, definitely accommodates and allows space for these frames to be incorporated, but doesn't see them as, or don't see them, or our work doesn't see them as to be exhaustive and comprehensive, but rather needs to be complemented with other analytical frames that are extremely critical.
Moshe, I think you have a...
Yeah, I just to add one word, because it's a very important question about the indigenous rights perspective, and the Palestinian Arabs are indigenous community, and their rights must be addressed and met, right? The thing is that the answer or the addition that I would say to the person, I can't remember the name because it's hard to see, that asked it, I mean, it is, if you go to logic, right, the discipline of logic, it will be as if this is a necessary but insufficient condition. It's a necessary condition to address, but addressing this dimension alone is insufficient to bring us out of the situation where we are. That's the issue here. And here, in a way, I rephrase what Leila said. I mean, it is recognition of indigenous rights, right? But at the same time, an understanding, right, that because we are all social constructivists, right? Social constructivism means that the approach is that something developed in the last 120 years, for better or worse, right? And there is no way, I think, that's the debate I had with another person that is not here today. In the world today, 2021, right? It's not a great world, of course, right? But there is no way that one can bypass, right? Create a bypass road around the phenomenon of ethno-nationalism. There's no way around. I mean, I'm in Manchester right now. Think of Brexit. Think of Scotland. Think of Ireland. Think of what's going on in Poland. Think of what I'm saying. This is something that needs to be addressed, right? So, I mean, I repeat an argument that, for example, Spain developed already in 1966. They said, I mean, even if, right, you can destroy the Israeli state tomorrow and remove the Israeli state from the world, right? The argument was that a collectivity, a national collectivity, a group of people, a Hebrew-speaking group of people that comprise 50% of the population between the river and the sea is still going to be there. You understand? Unless, of course, so this is why, and there's no way around it. This is why, in addition to addressing the issue of indigenous rights, you need to factor in, right, this entity, this ethno-national collectivity that is there. It's not imagined. You understand what I'm saying? And by the way, it may well be, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the best thing. It may be that, for example, in 50 or 100 years from now, once something new can come up and terminate settler colonialism, that something new can come up. But in the current phase, right, the current phase, addressing indigenous rights is a necessary condition, but insufficient, right? That's the argument here. It's not instead.
Thank you, Moshe, for your comment. So the next question is from Rebecca Vince. To what extent do questions of nostalgia, utopia, diaspora, exile, and return feature in this book?
Well, I can say something very briefly about this. I mean, this logic of exile and the dimensions of exile and diaspora, at least, and I see that Rebecca is very generous to invite us to comment at least on some dimensions, because this is a very big question, you know, and this issue of the exile and diaspora is extremely critical, and it is at the very core, or and it informs heavily our work. And one of the things that actually one needs to understand in connection to the question of Palestine and the Palestinians, that actually Palestinians, definitely in a post-Nakba time, for the overwhelming majority of their times, exilic nationalism has been extremely dominant in Palestinian trajectory of nationalism. It's actually after Oslo that, in a way or another, Palestinian nationalism got territorialized, or at least partly territorialized. And in that sense, there have been very fundamental members of our group who have been remarkably vocal about the centrality of exile and diaspora in that kind of Jewish tradition of exile and diaspora, and in the Palestinian context of the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish and many others, putting that kind of impact in there. So it does have an influence of some sort. It's really very fundamental to the conversations of the group. And quoting Nadia about this, critical agency. Actually, this kind of exile seems to be paving the way and creating the space and crafting the space for criticism, because it's also something that gives you the possibility to be critical about nationalism. As to the specificities of the right of return and really the kind of utopia and nostalgia and all of that stuff, Amos and I do that actually more in the Holocaust and the Nakba book, definitely in our introduction, at least in the sense of how these are being used and abused in order to further, kind of support certain kind of narratives and certain kind of tropes of nationalism that we think are very problematic. And therefore, this is why binationalism is a very disruptive form of notion. And the last thing that I want to say in this respect, that I think people should not confuse between binationalism as an egalitarian form of ethics, meaning that actually it speaks about the values that needs to guide us through any political intervention in the context of Israel-Palestine. Most importantly and chiefly among these values are parity, equality, and reciprocity of some sort. And it's really fascinating that for some, actually invoking equality is charged as being an evil, or is charged as being anti-Semitic, which is really ridiculous in that sense. So since when the commitment to values such as equality, which seems to be at the very core of egalitarian binationalism as a form of ethics that we seem to propose here, is something that is an evil that you need to eliminate, or is like is a virtue that you need to fight? I mean, this is only in the context of Israel-Palestine, with these twisted logics of policing and criminalizing the Palestinians and their struggle for justice and inclusivity, that equality becomes really an anti-Semitic. This is ridiculous in a sense. So again, I mean, what is really, and as an ethics is very different from binationalism as a binational state. So binational state is one possible articulation of the ethics of binationalism, but binationalism can be articulated in multiple forms of national state institutions. It could be federation, confederation, it could be even the two-state solution, but not the ones that they speak about. So the most important thing here is this binational ethics. And binational ethics, the way at least we deploy it in our work in both books, the Holocaust and the Nakba, and the book with Leila here on the Arab and the Jewish question, is definitely has this disruptive potential of really shaking and interrogating and challenging otherwise rigid, dogmatic, and dichotomous understandings of dynamics in the conflict.
Thank you, Bashir. I actually have a question, if that's okay. I'm just thinking about the themes of entanglement and the drawing of boundaries between entangled histories. I'm just thinking about sort of post-Holocaust European construction, or the formation of the EU identity, and how I'm just thinking about the kind of exceptional status that the Holocaust is given in popular discourse in many ways, how there's a sense that it's a kind of exceptional historical event, and it's offensive or discriminatory to draw parallels between other interlaced traumas such as Nakba. So I'm just thinking, to what extent is the kind of exceptional status of the Holocaust and kind of popular European discourse part of the project of the construction of a post-Holocaust Europe? I don't know whether that makes sense, but yeah.
Well, I can reply to this very briefly again. I mean, this is present in this book, but it's has bigger presence in the work that I do with Amos, with the other book. But you know, it's very convenient for Europe to depict this as an exception, because actually, if you were to say that the Holocaust is an exception, this is actually, you know, endorsing and confirming a European narrative of progress. It's just a deviation. It's just a historical accident. And this is exactly why this project, the way Leila and I are presenting it, is to be understood at the macro level as interrogating modernity in two of its most constitutive, or two of its most constitutive dimensions, that is the nation state and actually settler colonialism. Because the minute you start digging in Europe, you start realizing that actually, when you start interrogating Europe, you see that the genocides, the ethnic cleansing, the redrawing of boundaries that happened in Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and many other places, where, you know, all of these and this is where the Holocaust need to be understood and contextualized. And this is where the Nakba comes in, without obviously minimizing, you know, the status or the scope or the magnitude, obviously, of any of these kind of crimes, obviously. But the question is not here, you know, of diminishing the weight or the magnitude or the scope of things, as much as that you need to see them in a continuum and in a very historical continuity of some sort. So for Europe and for the constructions of the subjectivity of the European as to be a post-national kind of enterprise in an EU that by implication takes us to Nadia's constructions of the good Muslim or the European Muslim, this is a very perfect, you know, narrative that is actually convenient, because the minute you are not actually starting to interrogate the very core of the whole entire narrative of this kind of endorsement and celebration of progress and modernity and enlightenment of civilized Europe as opposed to other, when you start running in this. And what is really even troubling in this flora is actually the deployment of this Judeo-Christian civilization instrument that we mentioned in the book very boldly. You know, that also works and does some very significant analytical and historical deviations and misunderstanding and you know, troubling distortions to that. And this is why I think, you know, for Europe, and now unfortunately for the state of Israel, obviously, and for some very significant Jewish quarters, this exceptionalism and particularism is extremely worth it, and this is why this book, in a way or another, also tries to dismantle that and interrogate and challenge and question that. Again, challenge and interrogate without falling into the trap, obviously, of trying to minimize this. This is actually a different way of honoring the memories of the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust, and for that sake also the memory and the Holocaust of the Nakba and many other atrocities that Europe committed inside Europe and outside Europe. So, you know, so we need to be very careful to go to this track of exceptionalism. This is why entangled history and multi-directional memories, as Michael Rothberg and many others have alluded to in terms of entanglement, are the way forward to understand better these kind of complexities and intersections. And these complexities and intersections do not have to entail any form of solidarity. They can entail solidarity, but solidarity is not the key to understand this. Solidarity could be the potential of conclusion of how we can move forward. But there are conflicts, there are very serious, ruthless, eliminatory politics that is at work. And this is the way I think we need to be honest about reading the history of Europe and many other regions in the way. And this is why I think your question fits perfectly in understanding these three dimensions of the project that seems to be in conversations with each other and indicating the centrality of why we need to unpack that exceptionalism and centrality. And concluding, this is why this is interrogating Europe. This is why this project is also about interrogating.
Thank you very much, Bashir. So the next question is Amani Louis. The common ground between the two people is the issue of trauma. This is what they will share, and dealing with their respective trauma in the end is what might bring them together. So I guess more of a comment.
There's a comment by Muhammad Nahas, which I think I'm happy, if you would read it, I'm happy to answer it.
Yes. Okay. Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Neither Settler Nor Native, provides some insights to the history of the two-state solution and provides some pointers on how to move forward by using the idea of survivors of a political project. Do you think your work and his work can be seen as complementary that provide a strong argument for the one state?
Definitely, I do find the two books are definitely complementary, because Mamdani's book is really a critique of settler colonialism, but above all, he shows how the nation state and the colonial state are intertwined. You know, the nation state is a product of colonialism, and the nation state, like the colonial state, is based on exclusion, not inclusion. So the real challenge that we are faced, and that's how I read Mamdani's book, is what is the new political configuration you're going to have that protects people's rights in the 21st century? So yeah, his conclusion comes in favor of the one-state solution, whatever form it takes. And our book is trying to argue and show what are the issues that need to be tackled in an attempt to create a new political structure. So there's an attempt to go beyond the nation state. And how do we go beyond the nation state? Is by understanding trauma and how the traumas are intertwined, both the Palestinian and the Israeli. But also to start to think of how do you create a state structure that is beyond the nation state, which is accountable and inclusive. And that's something we still do not have it. I mean, Europe has tried to create it through the democratic state, the inclusive state, but Europe still, through the construction of the European Union, to push for a political structure post the nation state. But to buttress it with some strong democratic institutions and structures. But that's really the question that we're facing in the 21st century. How do we guarantee a state of rights that includes the diversity of its citizens? And that can only happen by accepting the entanglement of its citizens. And this means an understanding of the history of Europe and coming to terms to the history of colonialism, not to perpetuate it, but precisely to decolonize it. And the only way you can decolonize it is by admitting the entanglement, but also making sure that you respect the equality and the diversity of the citizenship. So yeah, I definitely see them complemented to one another.
Can I just say one final comment about this, because I think this is extremely important. Definitely, I mean, Mamdani's work has been fascinating and has been also inspirational to some of the work of our meetings actually in Vienna. And just to add to what Leila just started in terms of Mamdani in his latest book, while definitely Mamdani is pushing the boundaries of some sort, I think what needs to be really further checked in case of Mamdani, and this is a little bit of a challenge and a critique of his work, is that he actually, among many other things that he does in the book, including what Leila said, he is heavily inspired by the South African context and by South African case. And he seems to be coming to too much of the type of liberal conclusions, I guess. And that actually doesn't also surprise me if we take the South African case. In the context of Israel-Palestine, binationalism as a de facto reality and as a normative desired principle or ethics seems to be also a challenging and probably posing some questions to some of the conclusions of Mamdani, because Mamdani seems to be very much about this post-national kind of arrangement. Under no circumstances here, at least my understanding of binational ethics is we are saying post-national things. We are definitely saying we should not understand the articulations of political claim in exclusive ethnic national states. That's what we are seriously contesting. We are contesting ethno-national, vulgar, exclusive nation state. And I put bold on state as the exclusive and the exhaustive frame within which political rights are being articulated. Now, political rights can be still individual and can be collective national. And what seems to be the case of Mamdani, that Mamdani's work seems to be focusing on the first part of the equation, that is the individual citizenry, that he sees a political imagination or a political community that seems to be more of individual kind of character. And therefore, the recommendations that he gives at some point in his book seem to be without possibly, I know that he's critical of liberalism, but actually when you take them to the end of their logic and pack them, seems to be subscribing to some serious liberal principles that in the case of Israel-Palestine might be very, at least might run into serious challenge and serious interrogation historically and also ethically.
Thank you, Bashir. I think we have time for one more question. If the panelists are happy, should I read it out? Okay. Well, it is Marx's birthday, so I think I should read this one out. So this is Zavi Aziz Bender Benite. He asks, I wonder if one of you can comment on the question of class in this complicated story. It is Marx's birthday. Quick narrative to explain. The transformation in the region also involved major class transformations. Middle Eastern Jews in Israel have been proletarianized. Palestinians that were saved from deportation also became workers after 1948 and 1967. For a short moment after the occupation of 1967, the Israeli blue-collar working class was made of Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians. Today, this is no longer the case, but it is part of the story.
Well, definitely the class dimension is central to this discussion, and it is not something that the book addresses, but we are aware of, because I mean, one needs to write a book about the political economy of Israel-Palestine today and the political economy of whatever one-state solution. And it will not look good, because the political economy, because the class interests presently are not in favor of a one-state solution. The class interest, whether it is in Israel, whether it is in the West Bank and Gaza, whether it is regionally, you're having a two configuration: one, the proletarization of the masses at one level, and another, a concentration of financial capital, which is not in favor, which actually is in favor of a certain global or regional capital integration that can actually lead to some rethinking of the Arab-Jewish question, which you can see, for example, in the Abraham Accords between the alliance of the United Arab Emirates and Israel, which is trying to repose the Arab-Jewish question or depoliticize it in ways that do not bring a solution, but actually show how this pattern of normalization in the long run might backfire. But yeah, definitely the class dimension is important, and it's actually what led us to what we are today.
Thank you very much. Oh, Moshe, do you want to say something?
I'm wondering if Bashir wants to say something about class, because he has the right to speak first.
I actually, Moshe, thought that this question was perfectly fit for you.
No, that's okay. I must say that because, I mean, the debate that I described in my chapter, the debate in 1967, it's true that it didn't discuss very much the class dimension of the issue, but more than national question within a Marxist framework. So, for example, the question was, I mean, the debate between the two sides was, I mean, can you, when you look into the river and the sea, right? When you look into, exactly as you look outside the window here, right? So people ask, what do you see? So you see 14 million people, okay, individual, but do you see anything else? So the debate was that people said, so the PFLP said, the only thing I see a colonial situation. There's a national question in relation to the Palestinian Arabs, both indigenous in the country and in exile. So there's a national question in relation to them, right? But in relation to the Hebrew-speaking Israelis, I'm not saying Jews, by the way, the Hebrew-speaking Israelis, I see a colonial question only. And the way out is one person, one vote, and hopefully there will be also economic equality. So, but the competing Marxism was, no, I mean, what you see after 1967, it is no longer only a colonial question, but also a national one. And here, I mean, I want to just say one word about this, the issue of class in relation to South Africa, because we all the time compare and contrast Palestine, Israel, and South Africa, especially now when everybody by now, I think, recognizes the apartheid setting that does exist there. But here, I mean, there is the similarities, but also differences. And here, I mean, I said that the class dynamic in South Africa was much prominent in relation to generating a post-apartheid reality when compared to the question of Palestine-Israel, because the working class of white South Africa was Black. The working class of Israel-Palestine, right, is not the Palestinians, because that's the different dynamics in terms of the labor formation that took place in the two places. So Aziz Bendor that asked the question, even in the question, if you reread it, you see that he does recognize the fact that the situation, even in Israel-Palestine of the 1950s and the 1960s, is not identical to the situation in the 21st century. It's not identical. It's not the same. But of course that the economic dimension is important, because we see, for example, in South Africa, what after 94, we are what, 30 years after the apartheid system was overthrown, but in terms of the economic inequalities there, as if nothing happened. So of course that the issue of class and economic rights must be an issue that should be addressed, and not only issues of ethno-nationalism. So, but I think this can also explain the difference between the two cases. I mean, it's almost as if Palestine and South Africa are either apples and oranges, or maybe a green apple and a red apple. It's not exactly the same in terms of the cases, and one of the issues there, the dimension of class that differs or differentiates between the two.
Thank you very much, Moshe. So does anyone have anything else you'd like to say? Any other panelists? Okay, great. Well, I guess it's time to close the event. Thank you so much to everyone. That was quite an incredible discussion. We had great participation for the audience. And I'll just let everyone know our next upcoming event is on the 14th of May, and it's the book launch of Writing the Black Decade, Conflict and Criticism in Francophone Algerian Literature by Joseph Ford. So that's another book launch. I've posted links to the book and our website as well in the chat. So yeah, thank you everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.